Hello everyone. In this video, I will reveal a shocking secret about myself that I have been hiding for a long time. My name is Emily Peterson, 28 years old, living in a suburban house in Wisconsin, USA. 3 years ago, when I married David Peterson, I thought that this marriage would bring me complete happiness. David is a man 7 years older than me, calm and successful. He works as a technology engineer, a job that requires high concentration and many long business trips. That is also the reason why he is often away from home, leaving me alone in the large house we own. Although I had everything, the feeling of emptiness and loneliness inside me grew, engulfing me in an uncontrollable depression. When we first got married, everything was sweet. David took care of me every little bit, knew how to make me laugh, always cared and listened to me. But those days passed faster than I thought. His work required more and more time, and each extended business trip made us further apart. At first, I just missed him, longing for the days when he was home so we could be close. But gradually, that longing turned into dissatisfaction. I felt like I was forgotten, no longer important in his life. David started going to work early and coming home late. When he returned home, instead of spending time with me, he sat in front of his laptop, eyes glued to the screen, as if nothing else mattered. We barely had time to talk like before, and if we did, it was only short, formal conversations. I felt like I was being pushed out of his life, like a decoration in the big house we were living in. The lack of affection made me feel empty. Hugs and kisses gradually became less frequent. Sometimes I tried to create moments to be closer to him, but David always made excuses of being tired after a long day of work or needing to finish urgent work. The long nights lying next to him without a single touch made me feel abandoned, as if I was no longer his wife. I loved David. There was no denying it, but the lack of sex and intimacy was so unbearable. I began to crave release, to crave someone to fill the void inside me. Every time I looked at him sitting there, I wondered if he still loved me, if he recognized the needs I was silently screaming for. My mother-in-law, Ellen, often brought up the issue of children, as if it were the only thing that needed to be solved to make our marriage perfect. Every time she came over, questions about whether I was pregnant were asked, and her eyes were filled with longing and disappointment. I felt more pressure, not only from the lack of marriage, but also from the expectation of having children. In fact, we tried many times, but the lack of children only made the relationship between David and me more tense. I knew David wanted children, but his constant absence from home and his lack of focus on sex made it seem like a responsibility rather than something he really cared about. Every time she came over, questions about whether I was pregnant were asked, and her eyes were filled with longing and disappointment. I felt more pressure, not only from the lack of marriage, but also from the expectation of having children. In fact, we tried many times, but the lack of children only made the relationship between David and me more tense. I knew David wanted children, but his constant absence from home and his lack of focus on sex made it seem like a responsibility rather than something he really cared about. It made me feel vulnerable, as if everything I tried was not enough to keep his attention. Gradually, my sexual needs became stronger than ever, like an addiction that I could not control. I did not dare to tell anyone about this, nor did I dare to face the fact that I was caught in a spiral of desires that David could not satisfy. Every time I tried to get close to him and was met with coldness, I felt small and helpless. I began to wonder if it was because I was not attractive enough anymore. Those negative thoughts made me blame myself, but at the same time, I also craved relief. Every night I lay next to David, I tried to touch him, trying to create a little connection, but he just passed me by, as if I did not exist. His indifference made me gradually lose control. I no longer knew what to do to save this marriage, and the loneliness inside me grew stronger. One night, the silence of the big house became heavier in the dark and cold space outside. The air inside the house was stifling, even though it was just me and Mr. Martin. The cold from outside penetrated my skin, forcing me to pull the blanket around me as I sat in front of the TV screen. But the cold outside was nothing compared to the restlessness simmering inside me. The TV program was playing, but I could no longer clearly perceive the content, because Mr. Martin's eyes had made me fall into another world, strange and uneasy. When he walked walked slowly as usual, but his silence and gaze made it impossible for me not to pay attention. He sat down next to me, his eyes fixed on me, not leaving me even for a moment. It was not the normal gaze of a father-in-law, but something deeper, darker, as if he was examining me, exploring every corner of my soul without any words. A feeling of horror slowly rose in my heart, making every muscle tense, my heart pounding, as if wanting to run away from what was about to happen, although I could not determine what it was. The distance between us was closer than ever, not in space, but in feeling. The silence between the two of us was like a thin, hazy curtain, but choking my every breath. I felt like everything in the room was pressing down on me, making the atmosphere even more gloomy and stifling. Mr. Martin's eyes were no longer the familiar gaze of a gentle father, but sharp and haunting, like a dangerous undercurrent beneath the calm exterior. While I tried to stay calm, tried to regulate my breathing to cover up the anxiety that was gradually overwhelming, everything seemed to become more difficult. My hands unconsciously tightened the corner of the blanket, creating small but clear wrinkles and movements in the suffocating silence. With each passing moment, I clearly felt myself being sucked into a vortex of chaotic emotions, the key point of which was the man sitting next to me. The tension gradually turned into an invisible fear, seeping through every muscle, every thought in my head. I knew something was changing, something beyond my control. It felt like I, the room, and everything around me were waiting for something to happen, an inevitable transformation. Thoughts began to run wild in my head, terrifying scenarios playing out before my eyes, but I didn't dare to think further. All I knew was that Mr. Martin's presence, the way he looked at me, and the awkward silence between us did not bode well. Suddenly, a chill ran down my spine as Mr. Martin moved closer, so close, it was as if he could feel my every breath. I felt frozen, unable to move, unable to react, as if my every action had been paralyzed by his gaze. An unknown fear began to invade my entire body. From my fingers to my toes, every movement was locked by the obsession that something terrible was about to happen. Martin leaned closer and spoke slowly, clearly, each word like a sharp knife stabbing into my heart, choking me. He spoke of my loneliness, of David's inability to fulfill his responsibilities. Those words not only shocked me, but also completely shattered all my faith in this family. The whole room seemed to fall into a terrifying silence after he said that sentence. Only the sound of my rapid breathing echoed in my head. I felt my heart stop, my body froze, and in that moment I could only sit still, completely numb to what was happening. A shiver ran down my spine as I realized the meaning behind his suggestion. It wasn't just a casual remark or a mistake. He knew exactly what he was doing, and the way he said it made me see the intention and calculation behind it. Fear was the first feeling that took over my mind. It was like a wave crashing down, drowning all my thoughts and reflexes. I wanted to stand up, to run away from this room, from those prying eyes and those disgusting words, but my legs were rooted to the chair. The feeling of fear was like an invisible rope holding me down, not allowing me to move, not allowing me to resist. I looked at Mr. Martin, his eyes now shining, looking at me as if anticipating my reaction. I felt trapped in that gaze, unable to escape, unable to escape. Part of me wanted to scream out loud to break this suffocating space, but the voice would not come out. I didn't know what I feared more, fear of him, or fear of what was rising inside me. Because in that moment I couldn't deny that there was a part of me, deep and suppressed for so long, that was stirred by that offer. The loneliness that I had tried to hide for so long, the silent desires that had been suppressed, all of it was suddenly disturbed. Every word Mr. Martin spoke seemed to awaken emotions I had tried to bury. I couldn't deny that for a very brief moment, I felt the excitement of his offer. That feeling left me more confused and bewildered than ever. It terrified me. How could I feel like this? How could I be attracted to something so wrong? I wanted to push the thought away immediately, to return to reason, to the values I believed in. But the addiction inside me, that long-suppressed part, was not easily extinguished. It was not simply a physical desire, but a thirst for attention, for release from the emptiness of my current life. In my mind, a jumble of fear and desire, reason and instinct. Part of me screamed that this was wrong, that I couldn't let myself be drawn into this terrible temptation. But the other part, though I didn't want to admit it, was drawn to the prospect of being freed from the addiction I'd been living with for so long. The tug of war was unsettling, my heart pounding so fast I could hear it in my chest. Everything around me was spinning, and I felt like I was on the brink of a life-changing decision. The feeling that my world had been irrevocably turned upside down, that after this moment, nothing would ever be the same again. With that offer, an invisible line between me and Martin had been broken. Our relationship was no longer simply that of a daughter-in-law and father-in-law, but had now turned into something darker, more complicated and sinful. At first I wanted to refuse, wanted to walk away from the temptation he placed before me, but some force within me stopped me. The long-suppressed desires, the loneliness I had endured during the long period of not being able to have closeness and love from David, all forced me into the wrong decision. Whenever David was away, on long business trips, the large house became the stage for my betrayal with Martin. We were furtive, each time as a temporary release from the loneliness and desire that had consumed me. I knew it was wrong, that I had betrayed the trust of my husband, who had no idea what was going on behind his back. But every time I tried to stop, every time I told myself that this would be the last time, a deep part of me was pulled towards the darkness. I couldn't resist, couldn't stop myself from falling into this spiral, even though I was fully aware of the consequences. The moments we spent together were shrouded in darkness. The darkness of locked rooms, of hasty meetings when no one else was around. Silence and darkness were our allies, helping to conceal what no one else was allowed to know. But darkness is also an enemy, because every time it covers me, the feeling of guilt grows in my heart. The moments of passion that overwhelm reason only temporarily cover up the pain and torment that I have to face immediately after. After each affair, my heart feels heavy, as if an invisible burden is pressing down on every breath. The feeling of guilt rises like a wave, drowning me in torment. Every time David comes home, I can't look him in the eye. He is still the good husband, the man I loved and married, but now, that love is tarnished by mistakes I cannot erase. I avoided him, feeling like every look, every gesture of his was a reminder of the betrayal I was hiding. I tried to pretend like nothing happened, but I couldn't hide the feeling of insecurity inside. The feeling of being suffocated every time he came home, every time he held me in his arms. I no longer felt comfort, only strangeness and distance that I couldn't overcome. More and more, I felt like a traitor, a woman unworthy of the love and trust that David had given me. But even though I knew I was destroying my own life, I was not strong enough to escape the spiral of lies and desire. Every time Martin and I met, our secret relationship continued. It was a vicious and wrongful cycle that I could not stop, no matter how many times I promised myself it would end. I knew it could not last, that every moment we spent together pushed me further away from redemption. But then Martin approached me, and every time he entered the room, I was drawn into an uncontrollable whirlwind. His charm overwhelmed all rational thought, and I let myself be carried away by the feeling, unable to resist. Every time we were together, the guilt gnawed at me more and more. I felt the emptiness inside, but at the same time I felt trapped in a terrifying loop. After each sneaking around, I told myself that this would be the last time, that I would give up everything and go back to David, trying to mend what was broken. But when Martin's eyes met mine, when he came closer, those promises immediately disappeared, as if they had never existed. The cycle continued until one day, the secret I had tried to hide could no longer be hidden. It was a normal afternoon. David announced that he was going on a business trip and expected to be home late. I didn't think much of it when Martin approached me as usual. We continued our affair, unaware that David had come home earlier than expected. When the door to my room opened, I felt like my world had collapsed in an instant. David stood there, right in front of the door, not saying a word. He didn't scream, didn't throw a punch like I had imagined if my secret was discovered. Instead, he just stood there, staring at us with a blank, dead gaze. His eyes no longer reflected the love or tenderness I was used to. Instead, there was confusion, pain, and deep betrayal. I couldn't look David in the eye. My heart stopped, and my whole body became heavy and still. I knew it was over. Everything I had feared and tried to hide for so long was exposed, and there was no turning back. David didn't say a word. He just turned and walked out of the room, leaving the dead space between Martin and me. I could feel the tension in the air, but I could do nothing but sit there, motionless as a statue. That moment seemed to last forever, as I knew that everything David and I had was shattered beyond repair. The confrontation between David and I followed. When he finally faced me, his anger exploded in a scream. He accused me, not hesitating to point out my betrayal and selfishness. He said I had destroyed everything: the love, the trust, the family we had built together. I couldn't say a word to defend myself, because everything David said was true. Every word he spoke was like a knife stabbing into my heart, reminding me of the wrong decisions I had made. I had destroyed not only my life but David's as well. Martin, who was complicit in all this, could do nothing to appease David's anger. He said nothing, but quietly backed away, as if realizing that he could not change anything in this situation. His presence in the room only added to the suffocation and tension between us. The family I had once had, that I had hoped would be strong, was now completely broken. After the bitter confrontation, David could not bear it any longer. He left me, taking all the hurt and despair with him. The house we had shared was now empty. Everything in this house, every object, every memory, reminded me of lost love, of mistakes that I could never erase. Martin disappeared from my life after that. Without a word of farewell, without a trace, he left as if he had never existed. I was left alone in the cold house, with a sense of guilt and pain that could not be healed. Every corner of the house echoed with painful memories and betrayal, reminding me of the price I had to pay for my wrong decisions. I was left with nothing but emptiness and despair, and I knew that I would never be able to forgive myself for what had happened. From that moment on, my life was plunged into darkness. Every day that passed, I sank deeper and deeper into the pit of regret, unable to escape. The feeling of being trapped in pain and loneliness became an inseparable part of my life, and I knew that I had lost everything, with no way out.